One of the popular trends among Chicago Bears fans right now is to project a massive trade down outside of the top 20 to one of the teams that has extra draft capital this year. It could be nice for Ryan Poles to load up on picks to build out his roster, but is he in a position to truly pass on the opportunity to add a top 10 pick to this roster?
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on X at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on all of your favorite social media platforms, including the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. Terms and conditions apply. On the show today, we look at the possibility of not just a small trade down for the Chicago Bears, but a massive trade down, something that would feel like a blockbuster trade, but something that I've seen more and more Bears fans batting around the idea. Teams picking in the 20s that might have multiple second and third round picks or future draft picks to give up to move all the way to the Bears in the top 10, pass on the opportunity to get a top 10 player to pair with Caleb Williams, but add a bunch of draft picks to give Ryan Poles that much more to work with and continue building out his roster. We'll look at the value of picking ninth, picking in the top 10 compared to the value of picking later on in the first round and just how much it matters where that first round pick is. We'll also look at the teams. There's only a couple of them that really have the extra draft capital to load up and make a move like this without completely giving away their whole draft class of their own. And we'll look at how this decision-making process weighs for the Bears in terms of quantity versus quality for where this specific Bears roster sits right now. Like, what's more important to the Bears right now? Getting that top 10 caliber player or getting a bunch of not quite top 10 caliber players to add to this team? But I think it's important that when we talk about picking at number 9, right, I think it has this idea of like, oh, the Bears have a top 10 pick right now, and if Caleb Williams is good and this team is heading in the direction that they're hoping it will, the Bears might not pick in the top 10 again for, I think the plan would be for a while, right? And that the opportunity to get a top 10 caliber blue chip player is so rare that you got to land that great player here, because how often are you going to have the opportunity to get this good of a football player for your team that you feel like, man, there are a few guys in the top 10 that you can just feel really, really good about. The guy that falls to you at 9, boom, that's a home run pick and something that feels closer to a sure thing than whatever you might land, however far you end up trading down, especially if it's something like a big trade down like we're talking about today. Now, we've done previous podcasts earlier this month and in last month looking at smaller trade downs, what the Bears could get for the 9th overall pick if they move down a couple of spots or a handful of spots or closer to 10 spots. So we're not going to go through some of them perhaps more quote-unquote reasonable trade down projections here. You can go back if you haven't heard those shows, look through the podcast archives or on our YouTube channel to find some of the episodes in the past where we've talked about the trades possibilities, but we haven't talked about the big move down. And I just think there's this feeling of like, well, a bunch of picks could be great, but in the top 10, you're really getting a much better player and you're really getting, a safer type of pick. Just like, in the top 10, it's a home run waiting to happen. And as you get later in the draft, it becomes more of a crapshoot. And it certainly is true that the later you go in the draft, the less likely the odds are that you're going to hit a home run on that player. But those odds, the longer you go in the draft, the less change there is. And I think if we have an assumption or a presumption that picking at 9 is pretty close to a sure thing. Like, you're going to get a really good player with the 9th overall pick. And I want to challenge that assumption a little bit. It is certainly true that players picked in the top 10 are more likely to hit than players picked outside of the top 20. And the later you go, the less likely they are to hit. And that the players picked in the top 10 tend to be more talented and better, and is statistically and probabilities are better for you picking there. But it's not as though the 9th overall pick is a near certainty, and that the 20th or the 25th or whatever pick later on is, a near impossible or a total crapshoot at that point. Like, as the draft goes on, that range kind of evens out. That people have run the numbers on this, and we don't have to go through like the specific graphs and the specific metrics involved here, because it's more important to get the concept here than the specific, when you talk about like player value and sort of projected, or what we've seen players get in terms of like salary and in terms of like statistical measurements of success. And people have done this by looking at Pro Bowls as well. There's no perfect stat that measures how good a draft pick has panned out over their careers. But when you slice it and dice it in different ways, you end up seeing over time that there's this exponential curve that obviously the number 1 overall pick it tends to be most likely the top 2 or 3 picks are the most successful and the most likely to be successful overall. They do still bust, but like over the course of time, those picks tend to work pretty well as a percentage of likelihood compared to later picks in the draft. But it drops significantly once you get outside of the top 10. Like, it's an exponential that from pick 1 to pick 2, there's a big drop. And from pick 2 to pick 3, there's another big drop. And from pick 3 to pick 4, big drop. But every pick you go down, the size of that drop decreases, so that the difference between pick 1 and pick 5 is humongous. But the difference between pick 10 and pick 15 is much less humongous, right? It's an exponential curve that starts out really vertical and plateaus out as you go along, right? And there's different ways to measure this. There's people will look at things like, career approximate value over average. Again, I'm not going to get into like the specific analytics of the stats, but as you get farther away from the very top of the draft, the difference in the value of the picks is not as extreme. And so I look at the graphs and the numbers and say, okay, like, yes, the 9th overall pick is much more likely to be successful than a later first round pick. But it's not as though it's night and day, right? Like, it's the farther away you get from the top of the draft, the less change over time you get in where the outcomes come for those picks. Like, you're able to see it in terms of like the salary of players that over the course of their career, how much money they make and how much production they have over their careers. Like, as you move out of the top 10, it flattens out completely. So like the difference between 9 and 20 is pretty similar to the difference between 9 and 5, right? You could go 5 picks in one direction or 10 picks in the other direction, and it's a very similar type of gap in terms of how those picks tend to play out over time. Now, of course, every draft class is different, and that you might look at an individual draft class and say there are 9 elite players in that draft, and so if you get one of those 9, that's going to be a huge drop-off once you miss that group, and maybe you set that threshold somewhere in this draft. You say, okay, I've got to get one of these 9, 10, 11, 12 players that I see as elite, and then it drops off after that. But statistically, guys in the top 10 do bust, and guys outside of the top 10 end up playing better than some of the players picked in the top 10. So it is not the case that top 10 picks are a sure thing and that later first round picks are a crapshoot. Like, they're all a crapshoot, and the picks at the top of the draft are a little bit less of a crapshoot than the picks later on in the draft, but not hugely drastically so. Every year we see players picked in the top 10, in the top 5, in the top 3 that don't pan out. And we see players picked 15th, 17th, 20th, 22nd, 25th, 30th overall that end up being better than players picking in the picked in the top 10 and in the top 5. So like, well, there's definitely better odds and better players in the top 10. It's not as though trading out of the top 10 means you've lost your opportunity at a sure thing, or that you've lost your opportunity to get a potential blue chip player. You might not grade them as a blue chip player right now. You don't see blue chip players on the draft board get drafted 27th overall, 25th overall, but players that were drafted 25th or 27th overall turn out to be blue chip players sometimes. And players drafted 9th overall turn out to be busts or disappointments or underachieving sometimes. And just because you're picking earlier doesn't mean it's inherently like so much the clear and obvious better decision for a football team, especially when you weigh that on what the draft compensation might look like moving down. And that's where the Bears equation is different here. If the Bears had a bunch of draft picks, then there's less motivation to move down and more motivation to say, take the top 10 player there. But when you only have 4 picks right now, if a team wants to make a big haul up and is willing to give you a massive selection of picks to do so, when you're already lacking in picks, the supply and demand math changes a little bit for the Chicago Bears. So we'll look at some of the teams that have the draft capital and could have the interest in moving up and how that would look for the Bears in a year like this year's draft class next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. And that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs, because LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right people for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just a job board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals that you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. So you can hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. And it's a huge pool of candidates. I'm on LinkedIn. I bet you are likely on LinkedIn. And if you're not, many of your friends, family members, and coworkers are all on LinkedIn. So it's one of the best places to go out and hire for your small businesses. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. It's been popular for Bears fans to look at teams with a bunch of draft capital and say, man, the Bears could get a bunch of draft picks. Not just like an extra pick to move down a couple spots, but like draft class changing haul of picks to make a big trade down. And it's pretty hard for you to put together a mock draft or even go through, your favorite mock draft simulator on the internet and really find a team that'd be willing to give up, okay, if they're a team that has, say, that their standard 7 picks this year, 1 in each round, like if you're going to move outside of the top 20, they're going to give their first round pick, their second round pick, and their third round pick, and maybe something else. Like teams generally don't give up their entire draft class to move up that far. So if the Bears are going to move down from the 9th overall pick to someone really far down, it's most likely going to be one of these teams that has multiple extra draft picks so that they could send the Bears a first round pick, a second round pick, a third round pick, and a future draft pick or something like that, and then still have enough picks left over to fill out a draft class, but use those extra picks to move up to 9 to get a player they really, really want in exchange for the Bears being able to move back super far, get maybe a lesser player later on in the draft, but get extra draft picks that they desperately need when they don't have a lot of picks as it currently stands right now. So like, as I look at closer to the bottom of the first half, there are 3 teams that I think fit the bill, and really 2 are stronger than the other. Like there's one team that's close enough, but I don't see it as super likely. And then there are 2 teams that really have the draft capital to do so if they're interested and if the Chicago Bears are also interested. The team that I think could do it, but maybe don't quite have as much, but maybe they could talk themselves into it, is the Philadelphia Eagles with the 22nd overall pick. That'd be, 13 slots starting? I don't know if you count 9 as 0 or 1, then if 13 or 14 slots, depending on how you do the counting math there, go down would require a lot. Maybe not, multiple first round picks a lot, but the Eagles have 2 second round picks this year, 50th and 53rd. Is that enough to move to 22, like a first and 2 seconds to move down to 22? Like that would be huge for the Bears. You could use those 2 you could use 22 on a wide receiver, an offensive lineman, an edge rusher. You could use those 2 second-round picks to get a wide receiver, an offensive lineman, an edge rusher, a center, a safety. You know what I mean? There's a lot of different ways you could really help build out this Bears roster with a couple of extra second-round picks in there. The Eagles still have a 4th and a couple of 5ths, but like with the Eagles, they don't have a 3rd-round pick, and they just have the extra second-round pick in there. So that's why I don't feel like they have quite enough capital to really want to give up the entirety of the beginning of their draft and then not pick again until the 4th round. Like, is there a way they could do a 1st, a 2nd, and then like a future draft pick to still keep one of their seconds? Like, yeah, but it becomes a little bit messier at that point. It's less messy with the Green Bay Packers and the Arizona Cardinals. Those are the 2 teams that you look at as like, okay, they've got a bunch of picks and could be aggressive to move up. The Packers picked 25th overall in the 1st round. They have 2 second-round picks and 2 third-round picks plus their 4th-round pick. So they've got some extra draft capital there where they could give up their 1st, their 2nd, and a 3rd and still have a 2nd and a 3rd left over, right? They've got the kind of draft picks to do so, but you'd be moving down 16 spots to number 25 in the draft. Like, that's a really big move down. So it would take a 2nd-round pick, a 3rd-round pick, and more, or maybe the 2 seconds and more, right? It becomes a significant ask and a lot for Green Bay to give up, but they have a lot to give up that if there's a player at 9, they just really, really want. And you would hate to give the Packers access to a player that you think is really, really good, and maybe you just would decline not to, but we've seen the Bears and Vikings make draft day trades before. I mean, they're not opposed to do these trades within the division when it comes to draft picks. But the Packers have the ability to go all in to move up into the top 10 if there's a player they really want. Perhaps the most popular team that I think every fan base is doing in their mock draft trades right now is the Arizona Cardinals, because they have 2 first-round picks, right? They pick 4, and then they have 27 from the Houston Texans. They have a 2nd-round pick and 3 third-round picks plus a 4th-round pick. So, like, they've got a bunch of draft capital. But again, 27-9 feels almost unheard of, right? Like, you're going to go 18 spots up in the 1st round. It's rare that we see draft pick moves that far. But we did see something even just a little bit farther than that back in 2011 that might set kind of a slight, I don't want to say like the exact benchmark, because you can't take a sample size of one draft trade and say, all right, this is now our asking price 13 years later. But it's the Julio Jones trade. That was also the 27th pick. The Falcons moved up from 27 into the top 10 to draft Julio Jones, and they gave up the farm. They moved to 6, not 9, so even farther up than where the Bears are. So they gave up a little bit more than what the Bears would likely get for the 9th pick, because it's just not as far up. But to get one of those top receivers, they traded actually with the Cleveland Browns. They gave up a 1st, a 2nd, a 4th, and then a future 1st and a future 4th. So 5 draft picks. Technically, it was 2 first-round picks, 2 fourth-round picks, and a 2nd-round pick to go from number 27 all the way to number 6 to get Julio Jones. Now, the Browns in that draft, they traded down to 27 and then ended up trading from 27, actually traded back up in the 1st round and still used their multiple 2nd-round picks, and were able to ultimately put together a pretty expansive draft class, and the Falcons got their future Hall of Fame franchise wide receiver. Like, all things considered, that turned out really well for Atlanta, despite everything they gave up in a blockbuster trade to move up for Julio Jones. So the lesson there could be that, well, should Cleveland have just stayed at 6 and taken Julio Jones? I mean, maybe. And certainly those picks they ended up making didn't end up working out for them. But it's more about the process, right? If you believe in your ability to evaluate players, or you think, man, Ryan Poles could nail it with a couple of extra draft picks there, like, that's a pretty good way to give him that opportunity. Like, the Bears, if it was from 27 to 9 instead of 27 to 6 with the Arizona Cardinals, I don't think the Bears are going to get a 2nd and a future 1st and 2 fourths to go to 9. But could it be something like from the Cardinals where say you get their 27th overall pick and then like a 2nd, a 3rd, and a future 2nd? I mean, you start to negotiate here, like, right? How desperate are the Cardinals to move up there? How desperate are the Bears to move down? How do you find a value there that feels equitable? Like, everyone thinks at the time they thought the Falcons overpaid to get up for Julio Jones. Like, they way overpaid. So, like, you'd have to sort of taper down from that to where the Bears and Cardinals might be able to reach an agreement this year. But could you get a second, a third, and a future draft pick there so that Ryan Poles has all these picks and more future picks to keep building out this Chicago Bears roster and, let the Cardinals trade up and get another quality player if that's what's really important to them. And if I'm the Bears, I can add all these other good players that if I believe in my evaluation as the general manager, as my scouting staff, that I can find a really good player at 27 and I can find a really good player at 35 and I can find a really good player at 71. And like, man, I could leave this draft with 2 or 3 more really good players than I thought I would have entering this draft, as opposed to one potentially great player. Like, what's more important for me and my football team? Because I don't think there's a universal answer there, right? I don't think the answer to that question is the same for every roster and every team at every given point in time. Some teams are in a position where that top 10 caliber player, getting that perennial Pro Bowl type guy, is what they need to put them over the top, and it's what their roster is missing right now. And there are some teams where it's like, man, if I could get 3 really good players to fill 3 holes on my team, that would be 5-10-year starters potentially, if you believe in your ability to draft and hit those picks, which is no given, but like, you have the confidence to be able to feel like, man, I'm going to get 3 really key contributors. If I could just fill those holes, then the rest of the talent that I already have can be enough to carry us. And I want to look specifically at where the Bears fall on that spectrum and whether this is a team that needs that top 10 caliber player to just raise the top of the roster level of talent versus a team that needs 3 or 4 really quality guys to patch all of the remaining holes and then have a really complete roster moving forward. That's next on Locked On Bears. We know when it comes to the NFL draft, it is a competitive time. All these teams are trying to get the right picks for their teams. And certainly getting competitive is a big part of Monopoly Go and our friends making one of the most fun mobile games out there right now. I'm sure you've heard of it. It's been downloaded over 150 million times. It's a great twist on Monopoly where you play on not one, but hundreds of Monopoly boards in crazy locations, building up amazing cities that bring you big money. And one of the best parts is messing with your friends. You can charge them rent on your iconic properties, just like in the classic Monopoly, but then you can also rob their vaults of their riches. And you've got leaderboards as well that show you who the biggest Monopoly tycoon is among your friend group. It's not just the competitive side that can really bring it out of you, but you can also team up with friends, and people all around the world work together in timed tournaments to earn huge rewards. So you got to try out Monopoly Go. It is a lot of fun. Get in the game and join with your friends. Download Monopoly Go now free on the App Store or on Google Play. So the Chicago Bears have one of 2 paths here in this scenario, right? Is this a team that you just need that 9th overall pick player that's just going to be that top tier talent that you add to the roster that this team is missing? And it's that one more elite piece that's like, boom, that's what this roster is missing and needs and puts us over the top to start really competing with upper echelon teams. And I don't mean like this year, but over the next couple of seasons, right? You don't expect the 9th overall pick to be an instant all-pro player. You expect them to be good as a rookie, but then after a year or even 2, like, then they're difference-making all-pro, Pro Bowl caliber players, right? That's what you hope the 9th overall pick becomes. Is that what the Bears need most? Or would the Bears be better as a team in the long term being able to say, man, we got 3 or 4 or 5 total really good players to plug in these holes instead of like 2 or maybe 3, depending on how this draft class comes together, right? Is this a roster that has enough of those elite playmaking talents? Because like when you think about the best teams in football, like when you think about the Bears trying to be a Super Bowl contending roster, you need a certain number of dynamic, elite, game-changing players, right? You just need the guys that when you're down 3 with a minute left on your own 20, can this team can those truly special game-changing players come up in the biggest moments and make the big plays? Right? There's only a handful of guys that can do that. On any given roster, you're lucky if you have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of them across both sides of the ball. And how many guys do the Bears have right now that fits that bill? Certainly a lot of this depends on Caleb Williams, right? If Caleb Williams is an elite quarterback or a very good quarterback or a difference maker at quarterback, he can elevate the level of play of players around him and take lesser players that might not be top 10 picks and get them to play better than they have earlier in their career or than that their draft status or talent might suggest. Like if he can make, is he the type of quarterback that can make wide receivers better than they are with other quarterbacks? Can he make the offensive line better than it would be with Justin Fields or other quarterbacks because of his ability to get rid of the ball and manipulate the pocket? Can he make the running backs better than they've been in the past because of the threat of his arm and his legs and his ability to, make play action even more effective? Can he make the tight ends even better? Can he make the defense better because they're consistently playing with a lead? You know what I mean? Like Caleb Williams and what he becomes will impact what this Bears roster needs moving forward, as opposed to if Caleb Williams is good, but not anything, life-changing, and maybe he'll need a little bit more support. Maybe you feel like, man, if my quarterback is closer to average, I need to surround him with elite talent. If I surround an average quarterback with good talent, I don't want to give him any holes, but it's just not a great team around him, then you're limited on your ceiling, right? Like that's what it comes down to. Players that are top 10 pick caliber players can raise your ceiling. Now, where then does the Bears' ceiling lie based on those? Like, how many of those caliber players do the Bears have right now? I think between DJ Moore and Keenan Allen at this stage of Keenan Allen's career, like, is Keenan Allen that guy completely right now? I mean, probably for this year, but not for the long term. And DJ Moore is, or if he's not, is he 75%, 80%, 85, 90% of that? Like, he's not Devontae Adams. He's not quite Julio Jones, but he's very, very, very good. Like, do Keenan Allen and DJ Moore add up to 1 or 1.5 of these kind of players? I think so. Is there anyone else on the offense that is like truly take over, Mr. Reliable, dynamic player that is just like boom? I mean, maybe Darnell Wright could develop into that kind of right tackle over time, but I don't think Cole Kmet's going to emerge as that great of that elite of a player. He's a good player, but elite, take over a game, come up clutch in the biggest moment kind of player. I don't think. Like same with DeAndre Swift. Like could he? I guess maybe, but we haven't seen it yet. Like the offense doesn't have a ton of that outside of the wide receiver position at this point. But I'm not sure that with the top 10 pick this year, I mean, it would be an offensive tackle or a wide receiver, right? I mean, I guess maybe a tight end in Brock Bowers, but I don't think realistically that's super likely to happen. And then you talk about like the defensive side of the ball. Montez Sweat seems like he's that kind of player that can get you the big sack in the big moment to take over a game. Jalen Johnson is that kind of cornerback who can make the big pass breakup. Not always the big interception. You can't count on the big interception at the biggest moment at all times, but the big shut down the other team's number one receiver on the most important play. Whether that's a pass breakup or whether that's just not getting targeted at all because he's totally blanketed. Like Jalen Johnson is that kind of player. Montez Sweat is that kind of player. Tremaine Edmonds is being paid close to that kind of linebacker. I don't know if he's played that way last year, but like he's maybe in the conversation. So like right now you've got, we can nitpick like 2 or 3, certainly 2 guys for sure on defense, 1 or 2 guys on offense. And then if Caleb Williams can be that guy on offense, like that is the real game changer here. And the question becomes, is that enough? And does the player you take with the 9th overall pick move the needle enough to say, yes, that's the top level talent this Bears team was missing to put them over the top? Like, I don't know that taking Joe Alt as a franchise left tackle with the 9th overall pick, like, does that make them that much more of a Super Bowl contender? I'm not even talking this year, like over the next 5 years. If you upgrade from Braxton Jones to Joe Alt, like let's say Joe Alt becomes, Trent Williams even, or David Bakhtiari, right? One of these just Pro Bowl left tackles who's great. If you added that player to this Bears team right now, how much better are they? They're better. Does it change the offense completely? No. It helps. Makes a big difference. It's valuable. You'd love to have it. but it doesn't change the offense completely. And even over the next 5 years, it just gives you something super reliable. So like, I don't see offensive tackle at 9 being that pick that's like, man, that's the talent the Bears are missing. Like a left tackle doesn't take over the game. I mean, he protects the quarterback from one of the 4+ pass rushers coming at him, but he can't stop all the pass rushers. So he can maybe eliminate the other team's best pass rusher on a given play, and that's very valuable. I'm not saying it's not a valuable pick at all, but like, is it game-changing, carry you to, like, does a left tackle get you that much closer to a Super Bowl? I mean, it does, but how much closer compared to another edge rusher, compared to a wide receiver? Like, if Rome Odunze becomes, a Pro Bowl type, player, one of these 1,000-yard guys, like that lifts you up, that gets you closer. If it's Dallas Turner on the edge or Byron Murphy on the interior, like if those are elite 10-sack guys or whatever, like that gets you quite a bit closer. But if you draft those guys, say you draft Rome Odunze, like, right, that's the most popular pick for the Bears at 9. So you draft Rome Odunze at 9, but you leave the edge rusher spot to a 3rd-round pick or a 4th-round pick. You leave the future at safety for a 3rd-round pick or 4th-round pick, or a center at the 3rd-round pick or 4th-round pick. Like, you're still going to have some questions and some holes there. And how much closer are you then to a Super Bowl, to the success you want to be? As opposed to if you traded down to like 27, for example, or 25 or 22, or any of these picks we talked about, and okay, you get a, I'm trying to think like a player company. So you get an edge rusher who's a really good starter, but not a Pro Bowl caliber player. Like, I'm trying to think of like a good Bears comparison. Say you get, to go like a throwback name, like Adewale Ogunleye, right? Like, very good player. Not a Hall of Famer, not a Pro Bowl every year, but a really solid pass. So you get an Ogunleye player, a defensive end. Say you get, a Eddie Royal type player at wide receiver, or, I'm trying to think of like Bears. We haven't had a lot of good Bears receivers to comp here. Like, the 1 year Cameron Meredith was very good. Like, that kind of player at wide receiver is not Pro Bowl players, but like good, consistent player who can develop into more. I mean, maybe those are two underwhelming players, but you know what I mean? You get one of those, and then you get like a developmental center who becomes, a young Cody White or a young James Daniels type at center with one of these picks you got by trading down. And maybe you get a safety who becomes, I think we haven't had a good. These are all positions the Bears have struggled to draft well. So, but like, say you get average to above average starters at these 3 or 4 other spots. Caleb Williams comes into a situation with fewer holes. Like, is that better for your long-term roster than adding that one more dynamic player to the dynamic players that you already have? Like, part of the problem here is that the players you would take at 9 that are dynamic are mostly going to come at positions where you already have a really good dynamic player, and it'd be nice to spread that out a little bit more, but you can't, and that's okay. Like, just get the good players and figure it out later. But like, I'm not, so I think I see this as, I'm not convinced that the Bears absolutely need a top 10 pick player to put this roster over the top. But I certainly think there's good reason to say you only get so many choices, so many opportunities to get a player this good. So you got to get it while you can and figure out the rest of the holes later. Like, I think generally that's probably the better approach, right? Acquire great players whenever you can, because it's hard to acquire truly, truly great players. It's rare that you can trade for a Montez Sweat or sign a Jalen Johnson. Like, those are really hard to get. So when you have the chance to get them, go get them, because you can't get them any other time. But if you're not convinced that player's at 9 for some reason, like, trade down, get the picks, fill the holes. Like, at the end of the day, I'm fine with trading down to 27. I don't think it would be that horrible of a missed opportunity to get some great player, because you also need the picks to fill some of these other holes. I'd love to hear what you think the Chicago Bears should do. If the opportunity is presented to you to trade down as far as 27 or 25 or 22 for a bunch of picks, is that worth it to you? Or do you really think they have to stay in the top 10 because the top 10 is just so much better than everywhere else in the draft? Let me know in the comments here on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel. You can tweet us at Locked On Bears or post in the Locked On Bears Facebook group. However you do it, make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. The podcast is already running a little bit long here. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to these big trade downs, so we got to wrap up here, but I always want to make sure, of course, as we go over on our normal time here, that'll still make sure to give you another opportunity to bear down.